June 25, 1944. Saint-Lô, Normandy. The air tasted of copper and burnt cordite. In the hedgerows south of the Norman bocage, General-Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein pressed his body flat against the earth as the ground itself seemed to convulse. The commander of the Panzer-Lehr Division, one of the Wehrmacht's most elite formations, had survived the Eastern Front's frozen hell, had endured the Afrika Korps' scorching defeats, but nothing in his 2 decades of soldiering had prepared him for this. The American shells arrived not in salvos, not in barrages, but in what seemed like an unending mechanical apocalypse. Each impact cratered the Norman soil 6 feet deep. Each explosion sent shrapnel singing through the air in lethal harmonics, and they came relentlessly every 8 seconds, as though the Americans had harnessed the very rhythm of industrial civilization and turned it into thunder. Bayerlein would later write in his after-action report, with the clinical precision expected of German staff officers, that his division had been subjected to carpet bombing by artillery. But even that phrase, sterile and military, could not capture the existential terror of lying beneath a sky that had become a conveyor belt of death. The hedgerows that had sheltered his panzers offered no protection against shells that fell with the regularity of a factory assembly line. The earth no longer felt solid. It trembled like a living thing in its death throes. This was not how it was supposed to be. For 2 decades, the German military had built its doctrine on a foundation of offensive momentum and tactical excellence. The Wehrmacht's artillery corps was competent, professional, efficient, designed to support rapid maneuver warfare, to soften enemy positions before the panzers rolled forward in their irresistible steel waves. German gunners were trained marksmen capable of delivering precise fire on coordinates calculated by skilled forward observers. The 105mm LFH-18 howitzer was a reliable workhorse. The 100mm SFHU-18 could reach out nearly 15 kilometers. These were tools of blitzkrieg, instruments of a philosophy that emphasized speed, shock, and the concentrated application of force at the decisive point. When German officers studied the coming invasion of France, and they knew it was coming, had spent years fortifying the Atlantic Wall in anticipation, they expected the Allies to possess material superiority. This was understood. America's industrial capacity was vast, unmatched, untouchable behind its oceanic moats. But numbers alone did not win wars. The Wehrmacht had proven this repeatedly. They had shattered numerically superior French armies in 1940. They had very nearly broken the Soviet Union in 1941 despite being outnumbered in tanks and men. Quality, the Germans believed, would triumph over quantity. Tactical sophistication would outmaneuver brute force. A single, well-positioned 88-meter gun, manned by experienced Prussian gunners, was worth a dozen American cannons crewed by farm boys from Iowa. This was the comfortable calculus of German military thinking as the invasion fleet approached Normandy's shores. They would bleed the Americans on the beaches, attrit them in the bocage, and ultimately contain them through superior tactical acumen. The artillery duel would be one element of a larger defensive masterpiece, a demonstration of Germanic martial excellence against Anglo-American materialism. But in the hedgerows of Normandy, as June bled into July, that calculus began to crack like a porcelain plate struck by a hammer. The American artillery arm that revealed itself in Normandy was not merely larger than its German counterpart. It was a fundamentally different creature, born of a different philosophy, built by a different civilization. Where German artillery was designed to be mobile and support offensive operations, American artillery was conceived as a killing system, an industrial-scale mechanism for converting coordinates into craters, for transforming map references into moonscapes of churned earth and shattered bodies. The standard American field artillery battery consisted of 6 M2A1 105mm howitzers, and these weapons possessed a capability that seemed almost supernatural to their German counterparts. They could fire 20 rounds per minute in sustained operations, 40 rounds per minute in emergency fire missions. The M1 155mm howitzer, the Long Tom, could hurl a 95-pound shell 23 kilometers, far beyond the reach of German counter-battery fire. And behind these guns stood something the Wehrmacht had never truly encountered, an abundance so profound it bordered on the obscene. American artillery battalions in Normandy fired shells the way a wealthy man might scatter coins to beggars, carelessly, endlessly, without thought of conservation. A single American field artillery battalion typically expended more ammunition in one day of heavy fighting than an entire German division received in a week. This was not hyperbole, this was documented reality, recorded in the meticulous logs of both armies. When the 2nd Infantry Division attacked Hill 192 in mid-June, American gunners fired over 50,000 shells in preparation, more high explosive than the entire German 7th Army had available for counter-battery work across the entire Normandy front. But it was not merely the volume that broke German expectations. It was the coordination, the sophistication, the way American artillery functioned as a single vast organism rather than a collection of individual batteries. The Americans had invented something the Germans initially dismissed as impossible, the Fire Direction Center. This was more than a command post. It was a nerve center where mathematical calculations, radio communications, and industrial logistics merged into a system that could place devastating fire on any point within range, within minutes of a request. Forward. Observers, young lieutenants, who moved with the infantry, who shared their foxholes and their danger, could call down the thunder with a radio transmission that took seconds to complete. The FDC would calculate firing solutions using mechanical computers, distribute the mission to multiple batteries spread across kilometers of front, and deliver time-on-target concentrations where dozens of shells arrived simultaneously, denying defenders the precious seconds needed to seek cover. This was not artillery as the Germans understood it. This was orchestration, a symphony of destruction conducted by men who thought like engineers and factory managers rather than Prussian officers. And it was powered by a logistics system so vast, so incomprehensibly efficient, that it seemed to German observers like a form of magic or madness. Every American artillery shell that fell on Normandy had traveled across an ocean. It had been manufactured in factories in Pennsylvania or Ohio, loaded onto Liberty ships in New York or Baltimore, convoyed across the Atlantic under the threat of U-boats, unloaded at artificial mulberry harbors, or directly onto the invasion beaches, transported inland by truck convoys that stretched to the horizon, and finally stacked in ammunition dumps that held more explosive tonnage than some entire German army groups possessed. And this supply chain never broke. It never faltered. It delivered shells in such quantities that American battery commanders never, not once, received orders to conserve ammunition. Oberst Fritz Ziegelmann, Chief of Staff of the 352nd Infantry Division, watched his positions around St. Malo disintegrate under American fire and wrote with bitter precision, "The American artillery is a drum roll. Our artillery is a heartbeat." The metaphor was apt. German guns fired intermittently, conserving their limited ammunition stocks for critical moments. American guns fired constantly, a sustained industrial roar that became the background noise of the Normandy campaign. In the third week of July, as Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the Normandy beachhead, approached its climax, German field commanders began filing reports that read less like military assessments and more like testimony from survivors of a natural disaster. General Major Heinz-Günther Guderian, commanding the 116th Panzer Division, described American artillery fire as creating a wall of steel that made maneuver impossible. Units attempting to shift positions during daylight were caught in the open and obliterated. Battalions that had numbered 500 men in the morning reported 50 effectives by evening, not from infantry assault, but from artillery fire alone. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. German soldiers who had weathered Soviet artillery on the Eastern Front and Russian gunners were proficient and numerous, reported that American fire was qualitatively different. It was impersonal. In its totality, industrial in its persistence, Soviet artillery felt like warfare. American artillery felt like being fed into a machine designed specifically to transform living soldiers into scattered meat and shattered bone. And then came the realization that broke something fundamental in German military confidence. The Americans were not even using their full capability. The artillery that was destroying German formations in Normandy represented only a portion of American industrial output. Behind the front, in depots and arsenals, scattered across a continent-sized nation, sat stockpiles of ammunition that dwarfed anything the Wehrmacht had possessed, even at the height of its power in 1941. The Americans could sustain this level of fire not for days or weeks, but indefinitely. The war of attrition that Germany had feared was unfolding, and it was being conducted not by masses of infantry, but by cascades of steel that fell from the sky like mechanical rain. There was a sound that haunted German soldiers in Normandy, a sound that veterans of the campaign carried in their nightmares for decades afterward. It was the sound of American shells in flight, a freight train roar, a tearing of the air itself that provided perhaps 3 seconds of warning before impact. 3 seconds to pray, to press deeper into the earth, to make peace with God or fate or the emptiness that might await. And then the world would end in a hammer blow of overpressure and shrapnel, and in the ringing silence that followed, survivors would hear the next freight train already approaching. Artillery became the symbol of American power in a way that tanks or aircraft never quite achieved. The Sherman tank was adequate but vulnerable. American infantry were brave but green. But the artillery was sublime in its terrible perfection. The distilled essence of American industrial might transformed into a weapon system that rendered courage and tactical skill nearly irrelevant. A company of veteran German paratroopers, men who had held Cassino for months against repeated Allied assaults, could be annihilated in minutes by artillery fire called down by a single American lieutenant with a radio. In early August, as German forces reeled back from the collapsed Cobra pocket, General Feldmarschall Günther von Kluge, commander of Army Group B and one of Germany's most experienced officers, sent a situation report to Berlin that represented a kind of confession. He wrote that the American artillery advantage was so overwhelming that it compensates for their other tactical deficiencies and makes defensive operations extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. This was an extraordinary admission from a German field marshal, an acknowledgement that the fundamental assumptions underlying Wehrmacht tactical doctrine had been rendered obsolete. After the war, when surviving German generals were interviewed by Allied intelligence officers and military historians, their testimony about American artillery was remarkably consistent. They spoke of it with a mixture of professional respect and something approaching awe. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach, who commanded Panzer Group West during the Normandy campaign, stated flatly in his post-war interrogation, "The American artillery was the most impressive arm of your military. It was the primary factor in your ground victories. Not the Air Force, despite its dominance of the skies, not the Sherman tank, despite its numerical superiority. The artillery." General Oberst Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations for the Wehrmacht, admitted in his Nuremberg testimony that German planners had fundamentally miscalculated the effectiveness of American mass fire techniques. The German General Staff had understood that America possessed greater industrial capacity, but they had failed to grasp how that capacity would be translated into tactical and operational dominance. They had imagined a quantitative advantage, more guns firing more shells. What they encountered was a qualitative transformation in warfare itself, where the traditional relationship between offense and defense had been rewritten by American engineers and industrialists. Fritz Bayerlein, the Panzer Lehr commander who had survived that June barrage, wrote extensively in his post-war memoirs about the Normandy campaign. He described his division, equipped with the finest tanks and half-tracks Germany could produce, manned by veterans who had fought across 2 continents, being reduced to 40% strength by American artillery alone before it even made significant contact with American ground forces. "My division," he wrote with Germanic precision, "was killed by your shells, not defeated by your soldiers." This was not bitterness speaking, but a kind of clinical analysis. The Americans had solved a fundamental problem of modern warfare through sheer material abundance and organizational sophistication. They had created a system that could identify targets, calculate firing solutions, deliver overwhelming fire, and sustain that capability indefinitely. It was industrialized warfare in its purest form, the factory extended onto the battlefield, the assembly line transformed into a mechanism for delivering death with efficiency that would have pleased Henry Ford. In the final analysis, what German generals admitted about American artillery superiority was less a statement about ballistics or tactics than an acknowledgement of the civilization that produced such weapons. The Americans did not fight as Germans fought, did not think as Germans thought. They approached warfare as they approached everything else, as an engineering problem to be solved through the application of resources, organization, and relentless pragmatism. Where German doctrine emphasized the decisive battle, the knockout blow, the concentration of force at the critical point, American doctrine emphasized sustained pressure, overwhelming firepower, and the gradual destruction of enemy capability. Where Germans saw warfare as an art requiring genius and tactical brilliance, Americans saw it as work requiring competence and sufficient resources. And in Normandy, in those hedgerows where Fritz Bayerlein pressed himself into the trembling earth, the American vision proved superior. The shells that fell on the Wehrmacht in the summer of 1944 were more than explosives. They were messages written in steel, declarations of a truth that German military culture had refused to accept, that in industrial warfare abundance mattered more than excellence, that systems triumphed over heroism, that a wealthy democracy could outfight a militarized state simply by being better at making things and moving them to where they were needed. 50,000 shells on a single hill, 20,000 shells to support one regiment's advance, numbers so large they ceased to have meaning, quantities that transformed warfare from an art into an industrial process. The Americans did not merely defeat German artillery in Normandy, they rendered the entire concept of artillery, as Germans understood it, obsolete, replaced it with something new and terrible and quintessentially American, a weapon system that reflected a civilization of surplus, where abundance was the ultimate advantage, and the question was never, "Can we afford this?" but only, "Where do you want the shells to land?" In the decades after the war, as historians and veterans analyzed the Normandy campaign, the conclusion became inescapable. American artillery was the great equalizer, the weapon system that compensated for American tactical inexperience and transformed material advantage into battlefield dominance. The Sherman might be outmatched by the Panther, the American infantryman might be less seasoned than his German counterpart, but when the shells began falling in their terrible freight train roar, such comparisons became academic. The German generals admitted this in their reports and memoirs and testimonies with the precision and honesty that professional soldiers reserve for truths too obvious to deny. They had been beaten not by better soldiers but by better systems, not by superior courage, but by superior logistics, not by tactical brilliance, but by the grinding power of American industrial might transformed into thunder and steel falling from a Norman sky that had become, in those summer months of 1944, a ceiling of death from which there was no shelter and against which there was no defense. The truth they admitted was simple. They had never stood a chance.